I think most of us in here know that when life knocks us down, it's very easy to stay down. It's hard to get back up. When the road gets rough, it's easy to just quit. We see this happen in the lives of so many people, and maybe it's happened in ours as well. But the Bible is very clear, and that is that quitters don't win. Quitters don't win. When Paul wrote to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he likened their Christian life as if it were a race. And he says it is necessary for us to finish the race. It's necessary for us to finish the race. And so for us to win, we cannot quit. Yes. I don't know. I'm assuming that's what Dean is doing now. He's going to go outside and look. We also hear from this that only those people who overcome get to sit with Jesus on His throne. Jesus said that in Revelation chapter 3, verse 21. Those who overcome will have the privilege of sitting with me on my throne in heaven. So those people who don't quit, those people who overcome, those people who finish the race, that's what is so important. So therefore we have to have the courage and the determination to keep moving forward. A great example of this is found in the book of Nehemiah, something that Nehemiah tells to the people of Israel. Remember, at this time, historically, many of the Jews had came back from Babylonian captivity, had came to the city of Jerusalem, and Nehemiah was there to encourage them to rebuild the walls and the gates of the city. He knew how desperately they needed to do that. So that is what he does. So our text tonight is Nehemiah chapter 2, and we're going to first of all read verses 17 and 18, because there is one of the things we really need to see, and that is that encouragement has to be given. Encouragement has to be given. So in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, this is Nehemiah talking. Then I said to them, Nehemiah talking to those individuals, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to this good work. The first thing Nehemiah, we see when he gives them encouragement, he doesn't make believe that the problem isn't as big a deal as they thought. He doesn't sugarcoat it. Of course, he doesn't exaggerate either. He tells them this is the problem, this is the situation, this is how it is. And we need to do this together. So, he had made a thorough examination. He had gone to Jerusalem, he had undergone this study to see how things were. Back in verse 11, Nehemiah says, so I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me, except the one on which I rode. And I went out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well and the refuse gate, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem which were broken down, and its gates which were burned with fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. So I went up in the night by the valley and viewed the wall. Then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. Here is something that I think is very important about moving forward and moving on. Nehemiah spent 3 days investigating just exactly what needed to be done. He didn't rush into anything. He didn't underestimate it. He didn't overestimate it. He didn't sugarcoat it. He wanted the realistic evaluation of what needed to be done. So what did he do? He spent 3 days looking at the damages so he would know exactly what needed to be done. And I think that's very important for us. Any of us, any congregation, to move forward, we must see things clearly. We must see things clearly. So when we encounter any type of difficulty or whatever, we must have a realistic evaluation of it. So we'll know this is the best course to take. This is what we need to do. So we can't underestimate or overestimate the problem. We have to see it for what it really is so that we can know how to move forward. And notice in those 2 verses that Nehemiah stresses that it was the whole nation's problem. Not just his or a few people, but it was everybody's, the whole nation of Israel. Notice how he says in verse 17, you see the distress that we are in. See, he says this is our problem. It's not just mine, or it's not just the priest, or it's not just this group. He says it's our problem. It's all of us together's problem. And we know how easy it is to get discouraged if we think that the problem is all on us and that we don't have any help. You know, the Bible says in Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. So whenever anything happens, if we really want to move forward, then we must realize that it's everybody's problem. It's everybody's goal to move forward. It can't just be laid on the shoulders of 1 or 2 people. Nehemiah understood that. So he says, see, look at the distress we're in. We are in. All of us are in. Male and female, young and old, didn't make any difference. It was the whole nation that needed to take notice. This is what has to be done, he says. We cannot just expect a handful of people to move the whole nation forward. He says it won't work. So what does he do? So to encourage the people, Nehemiah sketches the history of his past life. Sketches the history of his past life. And shows how God's providence had worked in his life. We see how this is what God has done for me. So he's giving the people encouragement that this is what we need to do. Look at how God has worked in our lives in the past. He will continue to do that. If we go back to verses 7 and 8 in this chapter, he says, furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall and for the house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. He knows that these things happened because God was with them. The king gave them this letter, and they were able to get this wood, and they were able to pass through, and all of this because God was working for them. It was God's providence. So Nehemiah is encouraging them by saying, remember already what God has done for us. Look at what He's already done. So don't think He can't do any more. He can. He can continue to help. And so that's what Nehemiah does. And then he calls for them to be united in their efforts. He says, let us build. He doesn't say, you need to build. He doesn't say, I and a few men will build. He says, let us build, the whole nation of Israel. See, he's getting every single person involved. Let us build this together. There was this determination. There was this unity to work together for the goal. The walls had been burnt, they had been torn down, the gates had been burned. It all needed to be redone. But it was going to take a joint effort on everybody's part. John couldn't look over at Larry and say, well, Larry, you need to do all of this. And Larry couldn't say, no, John, you need to do all of this. There couldn't be any finger pointing because everybody had to work together to get it done. There had to be this unity for it to work. And if they would do that, there would no longer be this reproach. Back in chapter 1, verse 3, when Nehemiah is talking to them, he says, and they said to me, the survivors who are left, or when they were talking to Nehemiah, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. These gates and the walls had been burned and destroyed for a long, long time, and nothing had been done about it. So the enemies that were around Jerusalem were basically making fun of the citizens of Jerusalem and saying, look at your pathetic city. Its walls and its gates are torn down. And so they had become a reproach because of it. It says, we can't let that happen. Let us get together, let us build the walls, let us build the gates so that it will be like before. So they had to go and exhort one another. They had to encourage one another. And you know, that's what the Bible says can happen when we assemble. Let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some. So one of the purposes of assembling is to exhort and encourage so that we can get the work done. So just like Nehemiah was doing, everybody was to exhort and encourage everyone else so that no one would get discouraged and that the work could move forward. Nehemiah knew how important that was. The writer of Hebrews knew how important that was when that was recorded, and it's still important, so that we all are united in our efforts to move forward. The other two verses in our text says that when you do that, you're going to find opposition and difficulties. Verses 19 and 20. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you're doing? Will you rebel against the king? So I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build, but you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. When things are going well, opposition arises. When you go back to verse 10 in this chapter, it says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. They didn't want the well-being of the children of Israel to be restored. They didn't want the walls to be rebuilt. They didn't want the gates to be rehung. So they were not happy. And even today, religion is often the subject of ridicule. Whether it's in the media, on TV, even in certain government groups, religion is ridiculed. Well, that's what was happening here. The religion of Jehovah was being ridiculed and derided by these people who lived around. One of them was an Ammonite. So today, our beliefs can be scorned, they can be jeered at, they can be ridiculed. People in the Church of Christ are often ridiculed for their beliefs. We're old-fashioned, or we're legalistic, or we're this, or we're that, or we're blah, blah, blah. So even today, that happens. Well, Nehemiah says, don't give in to their scare tactics. Don't give in to them. Later on, in Nehemiah 6, we might say this happens again with some of the same people. Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 5. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before, the 5th time, with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. And you've also proclaimed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king, so come therefore and let us consult together. Then I sent to him, saying, no such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart, for they were all trying to make us afraid, saying their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to scare them into stopping the work. Because these people that were around those in Jerusalem were trying to get them not to rebuild the walls. They didn't want them to go forward. They didn't want them to move forward. They wanted them to be down. They didn't want them to do anything. And they couldn't as long as these were not rebuilt. There in that last part of verse 9, he says, let's put our confidence in God. That's what we need to do. Well, Nehemiah says that Jehovah is with him, and he's not with Tobiah or the others. Says, God is with me. He's confident. He says, God has sanctioned our work. We're doing the work of God. Therefore, God is going to bless us. God is going to prosper us. But Tobiah and Sanballat, you all get nothing. That's what he told them. He says, you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. God's going to give you absolutely nothing. Because you've ridiculed us, you've derided us, you've made us a reproach. As a result, you will receive absolutely nothing in Jerusalem. But Nehemiah says what we're doing is God's will. He knew it was God's will because God had told him, this was my will. So he knew it. And for us today, the only way we know God's will is through His Word. So as long as we do what's in His Word, we know God is behind us. That's what Nehemiah is telling us today. God is behind us. So we can have confidence that He's sanctioning what we are doing. And we know that because it's in His Word. Nehemiah said he had a great work to do, and he was not going to let those people, Sanballat and Tobiah and so forth, to sidetrack him from doing it. It says we have something very important. We need to rebuild these walls. We need to rebuild these gates. And Nehemiah knew that because they were doing God's will, they had an advantage. And we do too. As long as we do God's will, we have an advantage over every other group in the world. Because we're doing what the Word says. That's His will. Therefore, we know that He approves of it, and we know He's behind us. And we know He wants us to move forward because He says so in His Word. There's our divine sanction. We know this is God's will because it says it's God's will. And we know He's behind us. And we note that Nehemiah didn't hesitate for a moment to speak the truth, even in front of his enemies. He told them right to their face, what we're doing is God's will. And because of what you're doing, you receive nothing at all. In Nehemiah 4, verses 4 and 5, Nehemiah says, Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads, and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders. He's basically saying, God, you take care of these people because they are bringing reproach upon you. And that's what they were doing. By bringing reproach upon Nehemiah, who was doing God's will, they were bringing reproach upon God, because this is what God wanted them to do. Nehemiah is encouraging them. Says, regardless of what the enemy throws at you, regardless of the difficulties, regardless of the opposition, you have to keep moving forward. You have work that has to be done. For them, it was rebuilding the walls, rebuilding the gates. For us, we have work that God has sanctioned us to do. And it's been laid out for us in the gospel. And so, therefore, we know this is God's will for us. So we move forward. We do what He wants us to do, and we know that He's behind us. Just like Nehemiah knew God was behind their efforts. So we have to have courage, for one. We have to have courage to move forward, because the future can seem scary. Certainly it was for some of them. Look at the other enemies were all around. But they were told, you go ahead and rebuild the walls. You rebuild the gates. We also have to realize that not everyone is happy to move forward. So there's going to be opposition. There's going to be difficulties. There are going to be problems. They are going to arise. It's also easy to be overwhelmed by the task. When we look at the world and see the situation it's in and how most people don't believe in the God of the Bible, they certainly don't believe in Jesus Christ, and they certainly don't believe that He rose from the dead, we see that the task before us is great. But God says, don't be deterred into side issues. Keep your mind focused on what you're to do. And if you're doing what the Bible says you're to do, then God is behind it. And God blesses you when you do it. So we have to remember that if we're doing God's work, He is with us. It's just as if He is standing right beside us, holding up our hands like they had to do for Moses during the battles sometimes. Holding up our hands. He's there to pick us up when we fall. When we get discouraged, He's there to pick us up so that we can continue to move forward and not give up. And that's the lesson from Nehemiah, and it's a tremendous one. Because it is very easy to give up. It's very easy. Tonight we have an opportunity to sing an invitation song, an opportunity to examine our own lives to see if there is something keeping us back from doing what we need to do. And tonight, as we sing this song, I encourage you to come as we stand and sing. Let us stand, please.